Hi folks, so since I started in HEMA all those years ago, it's become standard now for longsword, for example. Lots of longsword sparring is done with Federschwerts, okay? And the Federschwert is a flexible version of the longsword, designed to be more flexible than a real longsword, so it's more kind in the thrust. And usually the point of balance is closer to the hand, so it hits with less mass at the tip of the blade. I've talked many times in previous videos about Feders and Federschwerts, and equally, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, you can Google them. They're quite common. They are pretty much the standard longsword sparring implement these days, and they were in fact in most parts of Europe in the 15th and 16th century as well. The rapier, which is probably the second most popular HEMA weapon, has its exact equivalent. It has a flexible version of the real rapier. Okay, so this is the Hamway. It's a fairly cheap one. I don't have a darkwood to hand, but if you're wanting to buy a good sparring rapier, I would recommend darkwood. They're pretty much the best economy ones. Or if you have a bit more money to spend or in a bit more time, you're willing to wait a little bit longer, then go to someone like Marco Danelli, who can make a tailor-made, custom-made one-off piece for you to the same kind of performance specs as a darkwood. But anyway, the rapiers are, the thing that differs in them from a real rapier is that they're like this. They bend very, very easily, and therefore they're very safe in the thrust. You can jab people till the cows come home and you're not going to injure them, assuming that they're wearing the correct jacket, mask, gloves and so on. Okay, so what makes them friendly for sparring is the fact that they bend. And I've noticed a trend in recent years that people have, certain people have started realising that if you're going into a competition, often you have an advantage if you have a stiffer blade. Okay, and that's undoubtedly true. If you're using if you're using a darkwood against a Hanway, then what you'll find is the person with the darkwood naturally has an advantage because they have a stiffer blade, so therefore when they engage the Hanway blade, it's easier to push it out of the way and apply your own point. Okay, essentially because they've got less ability to resist or push against your blade than you have against theirs. Okay, so stiffness is an advantage. Now this isn't such a big issue with longsword, in other words with longsword Feders, however it is an issue to some extent. And I've noticed that, as I mentioned, there's a tendency now to go towards stiffer and stiffer blades, both in rapier and longsword, because it gives you an advantage. Okay, but there is a point at which we have to say, hold on there, that's too stiff. You could have a blade which is as stiff as a real longsword, like an Albion longsword or a sharp Marco Danelli rapier. In other words, very stiff, and it would give you quite a big advantage in your tournament or in your regular sparring, but it wouldn't be very nice to your training partner. So really what I want to say is, I think that in HEMA what we need to move towards is a minimum and maximum flex per pound. In other words, if you apply a fixed pressure to the sword, I don't know what pressure that would be. We'd obviously have to experiment and find the right balance. But if a certain amount of pressure is applied to a blade, it diverts from the straight line to either a minimum or maximum amount and not more or less than that. And this is standard in sport fencing weapons, in foil epee and sabre. You wouldn't be allowed to have a blade that is too stiff, and equally for safety measures you don't want a blade that's really too flexible because it's more likely to snap under most conditions. Okay, so I think in HEMA we do need to start thinking about regulating the amount of flex in the weapons that we're using. Maybe not in classes, because they're more difficult to regulate, but also people should be allowed within certain parameters to do more or less whatever they like in their classes. But in tournaments, I think we should start to have tournament standards for maximum and minimum flex. Basically because it's very unfair as it stands if you run, say, a rapier tournament and one person turns up with a really, really stiff blade and another person turns up with a standard Hanway or darkwood and it's got a more flexible blade. Firstly because the person with the stiff blade has an unfair advantage, but secondly, because the person with the stiff blade is going to hurt the other person more with the stiff blade than the person who's been a bit more compassionate and used a nice flexible blade. Okay, so that's all I really want to say. I think we're going to have to, I know some people like to pull away from anything which is like regulation or sportification or whatever you want to call it, but for martial, logical reasons, I think it's important that we do start to look at a way of regulating the amount of flexibility we tolerate within blades used in tournaments. Cheers!